Have you ever wondered why certain narcissists seem absolutely terrified of you, while others see you as an easy target? There's a profound psychological reason for this that Carl Jung documented in his private notes, but rarely discussed publicly. According to Jung's secret classification system, there are 5 distinct types of empaths, and each possesses a specific psychological makeup that renders certain narcissistic tactics completely ineffective against them. What most people don't realize is that you're not just an empath. You're a specific empath archetype with unique psychological defenses that, when activated, make you literally untouchable to certain manipulators. I've spent years studying these hidden classifications, and what I've discovered is that most empaths never activate their full potential because they don't understand their specific type. Today, I'm going to reveal Jung's complete empath classification system, including the specific psychological triggers that activate each type's most powerful defenses. If you've ever felt powerless against manipulation or wondered why you can sense things others can't, what you learn in the next few minutes might completely transform how you understand yourself and navigate your relationships. This isn't theory. This is applied psychological knowledge that's changing lives. Before we dive deeper into these 5 deadly empath types, take a second right now to hit that subscribe button. Our community is growing every day with people just like you who are awakening to their true psychological potential. And if you're ready to accelerate this transformation, join our membership circle, where we share daily in-depth content on psychological empowerment that you won't find anywhere else. The kind of insights that are helping thousands reclaim their personal power in ways they never thought possible. Now let's explore Jung's secret classification system together. What Carl Jung discovered through his clinical work was that empathic ability isn't a monolithic trait. It expresses itself through 5 distinct psychological architectures, each with unique strengths and vulnerabilities. Understanding your specific empath type is crucial because each requires a different activation pathway to access their full protective capabilities. Most empaths struggle because they're applying generic empath advice that wasn't designed for their specific psychological makeup. This is like trying to unlock a sophisticated security system with the wrong code. It simply won't activate no matter how perfectly you execute it. The first deadly empath type Jung identified was what he called the reflective empath. This type possesses an extraordinary psychological mirroring capacity that, when activated, creates what Jung described as perfect narcissistic kryptonite. The reflective empath has an unconscious ability to absorb and then reflect back the shadow material that narcissists work so diligently to hide from themselves. Before activation, this quality makes reflective empaths particularly vulnerable to gaslighting and reality distortion, as they naturally question their perceptions when they conflict with others' stated experiences. But here's what makes this type so deadly once activated. When reflective empaths become conscious of their mirroring capacity, they develop the ability to reflect back the narcissist's disowned material with such precision that it triggers what psychologists now call narcissistic injury cascade, a psychological state where the narcissist's carefully constructed false self begins to disintegrate upon contact. This isn't something the reflective empath does intentionally to cause harm. It's simply what happens when their natural psychological function operates without interference from people-pleasing or self-doubt. Does this sound like you? Do you often find yourself unexpectedly triggering intense emotional reactions in certain people, particularly when you're simply being honest about your perceptions? Do you frequently absorb others' emotions, but then find them becoming unusually defensive around you, as if you've seen something they're trying to hide? These are classic signs that you might be a reflective empath who hasn't yet fully activated their reflective capacity. When this activation occurs, you'll notice that manipulative people can no longer sustain their facades in your presence, not because you're attacking them, but because your very way of being makes their false self impossible to maintain. The second deadly empath type in Jung's classification is the intuitive empath. This type possesses an extraordinary capacity for pattern recognition that operates primarily below conscious awareness. Before activation, intuitive empaths often experience their gift as a series of inexplicable hits about people or situations, gut feelings or instant knowings that they frequently dismiss or override with logical reasoning. This dismissal of their intuitive hits makes them particularly vulnerable to manipulators who rely on logical-sounding explanations to override the target's instinctual warning signals. But when intuitive empaths activate their full potential, they develop what Jung called psychological X-ray vision, the ability to perceive manipulative patterns instantly, often before the manipulator has even fully deployed them. This capacity doesn't operate through conscious analysis, but through a sophisticated form of pattern recognition that registers in the body before reaching the conscious mind. When fully activated, intuitive empaths can sense incongruence between someone's words and intentions with such precision that manipulation becomes essentially impossible to execute successfully against them. Do you often have strong intuitive hits about people that you talk yourself out of, only to later discover your initial impression was correct? Do you sense hidden agendas or unstated motivations, but dismiss these perceptions as unfair judgments? These are signs that you might be an intuitive empath who hasn't yet learned to trust and integrate your intuitive function. When this integration occurs, you'll find yourself navigating complex human dynamics with an almost uncanny accuracy, able to sense the true nature of people and situations without needing external validation of your perceptions. The third deadly empath type Jung identified was the boundary empath. This rare type possesses an extraordinary capacity for energetic differentiation that, when activated, creates what Jung described as impenetrable psychological sovereignty. Before activation, boundary empaths often experience their gift as an overwhelming sensitivity to others' emotional states, leading to constant emotional contagion and difficulty distinguishing between their feelings and those they're absorbing from others. This makes them particularly vulnerable to emotional manipulation and energy vampirism. But when boundary empaths activate their full potential, they develop the ability to maintain complete energetic integrity even in the most chaotic emotional environments. Unlike other empath types, who might need to physically remove themselves from overwhelming situations, activated boundary empaths can remain fully present while maintaining perfect clarity about where they end and others begin. This creates a natural immunity to emotional manipulation tactics that rely on blurring these boundaries, such as guilt induction, emotional flooding, and responsibility shifting. Does this sound familiar? Do you find yourself overwhelmed in emotionally charged environments, absorbing others' feelings until you can no longer identify your own? Do you struggle to maintain your sense of self when strong personalities are present? These are indications that you might be a boundary empath who hasn't yet activated your differentiation capacity. When this activation occurs, you'll experience a profound shift, maintaining your emotional clarity and personal truth regardless of the emotional weather around you. The fourth deadly empath type is what Jung called the transmutative empath. This exceptionally rare type possesses an extraordinary capacity for psychological alchemy, the ability to absorb negative emotional energy and transmute it into something entirely different. Before activation, Transmutative empaths often find themselves in the role of emotional processing centers for everyone around them, absorbing others' psychological toxicity and frequently becoming ill or depleted as a result. This makes them particularly attractive to narcissists who unconsciously seek vessels for their disowned emotional material. But when transmutative empaths activate their full potential, they develop what Jung described as alchemical immunity, the ability to process others' psychological projections without absorbing their toxic effects. Rather than serving as passive receptacles for others' unprocessed material, they become active transformers who can receive this energy, transmute it, and return it in an altered state. This capacity renders projection-based manipulation completely ineffective, as the projected material no longer sticks or causes harm, but instead undergoes transformation in the presence of the activated transmutative empath. Do you often find yourself serving as the emotional dumping ground for others, absorbing their negativity and feeling physically affected by it? Do you notice that people seem to feel better around you while you end up carrying their emotional burdens? These are signs that you might be a transmutative empath who hasn't yet activated your alchemical capacity. When this activation occurs, you'll find yourself able to remain in challenging emotional environments without taking on their toxic effects, transforming rather than absorbing the energies around you. The fifth and most deadly empath type in Jung's classification is the sovereign empath. This extremely rare type possesses what Jung called complete psychological autonomy, a state where external validation and approval have zero impact on their sense of self or perception of reality. Before activation, sovereign empaths often appear highly susceptible to approval-seeking behaviors and people-pleasing tendencies, making them seem like easy targets for manipulators who leverage these needs to control others. But this apparent vulnerability is deceptive. When sovereign empaths activate their full potential, they undergo what Jung described as the ultimate psychological liberation, a complete disconnection of their self-concept from external validation. This creates the most profound form of immunity to narcissistic manipulation, as nearly all such tactics rely on leveraging the target's need for approval, validation, or acceptance. When this need no longer exists, the manipulator finds themselves without any psychological leverage whatsoever. Does this resonate with you? Do you find yourself constantly seeking approval and validation, despite a deep inner knowing that you shouldn't need these external confirmations? Do you shapeshift in different social contexts while feeling a strange sense of inauthenticity? These are indications that you might be a sovereign empath who hasn't yet activated your autonomy. When this activation occurs, you'll experience a profound liberation, the ability to remain perfectly true to yourself regardless of others' opinions or reactions. What's most fascinating about Jung's classification system is his observation that most empaths aren't purely one type, but rather a combination of two or sometimes three types, with one serving as their dominant function. This creates unique psychological profiles with specific activation requirements and protective capacities. Understanding your primary and secondary types is crucial for activating your full empathic potential. Now let's explore the specific psychological triggers that activate each empath type's protective capabilities. For the reflective empath, the activation trigger is what Jung called conscious mirroring, the deliberate practice of noticing what emotions and projections you're absorbing from others and consciously reflecting them back without alteration or interpretation. This isn't done as manipulation or attack, but as a practice of psychological integrity, simply reflecting reality rather than absorbing or processing it for others. This practice creates an immediate shift in the reflective empath's psychological functioning. Rather than serving as an unconscious mirror that absorbs and internalizes others' projections, They become a conscious mirror that reflects with perfect clarity. This shift is often accompanied by a strange phenomenon. Manipulative people become increasingly uncomfortable in the reflective empath's presence, often describing the experience as feeling exposed or seen through without being able to identify exactly why. For the intuitive empath, the activation trigger is what Jung called body-centered perception, the practice of locating and trusting the physical sensations that accompany intuitive hits rather than requiring mental validation for these perceptions. This means deliberately shifting attention to how intuitive information registers in the body, perhaps as a tightening in the chest, a sinking feeling in the stomach, or a sudden wave of energy, and honoring these sensations as valid data rather than dismissing them as irrational responses. This practice bypasses the conscious mind's tendency to override intuitive information with logical reasoning, creating direct access to the intuitive empath's pattern recognition system. When this access is established, intuitive hits become increasingly clear and reliable, often arriving with a distinctive physical signature that the empath learns to recognize and trust. This creates immediate immunity to gaslighting and reality distortion tactics, as the empath's trust in their perceptions no longer depends on external validation or logical explanation. For the boundary empath, the activation trigger is what Jung called energetic differentiation, the deliberate practice of identifying the subtle qualitative difference between self-generated emotions and absorbed emotions. This difference can be extremely subtle and requires focused attention to discern, but Jung observed that there's always a perceptible difference in how these two categories of emotion feel in the body. Self-generated emotions have an integrated quality, while absorbed emotions feel somewhat foreign or incongruent with the boundary empath's overall emotional state. This practice creates what Jung described as an energetic immune system, an automatic filtration mechanism that processes emotional input before it's internalized. Rather than blocking emotional information, which would diminish the empath's natural sensitivity, this system simply tags the information with its correct source, preventing the boundary confusion that makes emotional manipulation possible. When this system is fully activated, the boundary empath can remain fully receptive to emotional information while maintaining perfect clarity about its origins and nature. For the transmutative empath, the activation trigger is what Jung called conscious metabolization, the deliberate practice of working with absorbed negative energy rather than trying to avoid or expel it. This involves a specific internal process where the empath acknowledges the absorbed energy, allows it to be fully present in their awareness without resistance, and then intentionally transforms its nature through focused attention. This isn't about changing negative thoughts to positive ones through affirmations, but about working directly with the energetic quality of the absorption. This practice activates the transmutative empath's natural alchemical capacity, transforming it from an unconscious process that depletes their energy to a conscious process that actually generates energy. Jung observed that fully activated transmutative empaths often report feeling energized rather than depleted after encounters that would previously have left them exhausted, not because they're blocking the absorption, but because they're consciously participating in the transformation process. For the sovereign empath, the activation trigger is what Jung called self-referencing, the deliberate practice of checking every perception, decision, and value against an internal standard rather than an external one. This involves developing the habit of asking, "Is this true for me?" rather than, "Will this be acceptable to others?" when navigating life choices both large and small. It requires a fundamental shift from seeking external validation to cultivating internal validation through consistent self-trust and self-respect. This practice activates the sovereign empath's natural autonomy, transforming their orientation from externally referenced to internally referenced. Jung observed that this shift often occurs gradually, and then suddenly, a tipping point is reached where the empath's need for external validation simply falls away, revealing a natural psychological sovereignty that was present beneath the conditioned need for approval. When this activation is complete, manipulative tactics that leverage approval-seeking behavior become entirely ineffective. What happens when an empath fully activates their type-specific protective capacities? Jung observed a fascinating phenomenon. Narcissists and other manipulative personalities seem to recognize the activation at some unconscious level and begin to avoid the activated empath entirely. It's as if they can sense that their usual tactics will be ineffective or even dangerous to deploy against this particular target. This avoidance isn't conscious strategy, but rather an instinctive response to the absence of the psychological vulnerabilities they're accustomed to exploiting. This creates an interesting paradox. The empath who no longer needs protection from manipulative people naturally receives it through this unconscious avoidance response. They don't need to identify narcissists or consciously defend against manipulation because their very psychological presence serves as a natural deterrent. Jung described this as effortless boundary maintenance. Boundaries that don't need to be verbally established or actively enforced because they're built into the empath's way of being. But what about empaths who find themselves in unavoidable relationships with narcissistic personalities, family members, co-parents, or workplace relationships? Jung observed that activation creates not just protection, but a profound shift in the dynamic itself. The narcissist's usual manipulation tactics not only become ineffective, but often backfire, creating consequences for the manipulator rather than the target. This isn't because the empath is retaliating or employing counter-manipulation, but because the natural laws of psychological interaction are no longer being distorted by the empath's unconscious participation in the dynamic. This shift can be challenging for both parties, as it represents a fundamental restructuring of a relationship that may have existed for years or even decades. The narcissist typically cycles through escalating manipulation attempts before recognizing at some level that the old dynamic is no longer accessible. At this point, one of two things generally happens. Either the narcissist withdraws from the relationship to seek easier targets, or the relationship transforms into something more authentic as the narcissist is forced to engage without their usual manipulative strategies. What's most remarkable about Jung's empath classification system is how it transforms our understanding of empathic sensitivity from a vulnerability to be managed into a sophisticated psychological capacity to be activated. Each of the 5 empath types represents not a burden to bear, but a specific form of psychological intelligence that, when fully expressed, creates natural immunity to manipulation, while enhancing the empath's ability to navigate complex human dynamics with precision and clarity. This perspective shift is liberating for empaths who've been told that their sensitivity makes them easy targets, or that they need to toughen up to protect themselves from exploitation. Jung's research suggests the opposite, that the path to empathic empowerment isn't about becoming less sensitive, but about becoming more consciously engaged with the specific form of sensitivity you possess. It's about activation rather than armor, expression rather than protection. I've witnessed this transformation in thousands of empaths who've applied Jung's classification system to understand and activate their specific type. One reflective empath described the shift perfectly. "It's like I spent years trying to dim my mirror because I thought the problem was that I reflected too much. Now I understand that the solution was to make my reflection more conscious and precise, not less powerful." When I stopped absorbing reflections and started simply reflecting them accurately, everything changed. Dienst, an intuitive empath, shared a similar experience. I used to think my intuitive hits were just anxiety or overthinking, so I was constantly talking myself out of what I knew to be true. Learning to locate these hits in my body, rather than trying to validate them with my mind, was revolutionary. Now I can distinguish between actual anxiety and intuitive information, and my hit rate for accurate perceptions is nearly perfect. A boundary empath described their activation experience this way. The game changer was realizing that I didn't need to block emotions to maintain boundaries. I just needed to correctly identify where they were coming from. Once I could feel the difference between my emotions and absorbed ones, maintaining boundaries became effortless rather than exhausting. I can be fully present with someone in emotional pain without taking on their pain as my own. Purnam, a transmutative empath, shared this insight. I spent years trying to protect myself from absorbing negative energy, not realizing that absorption and transformation was actually my gift. When I stopped resisting the absorption and started consciously participating in the transformation process, everything shifted. Now I can sit with the most toxic emotional states and watch them transform without depleting me. And a sovereign empath described their activation experience with beautiful simplicity. I realized one day that I was still making decisions based on what would please others, despite all my talk about boundaries and self-care. When I started genuinely checking each choice against my internal compass, rather than anticipated external reactions, I felt this incredible liberation. It wasn't about becoming selfish. It was about becoming authentic. And strangely, my relationships improved rather than suffered. These testimonials reflect the consistent pattern Jung observed. When empaths activate according to their specific type, they experience not just protection from manipulation, but a profound enhancement of their natural gifts. The sensitivity that once felt like a liability becomes their greatest strength, allowing them to navigate human dynamics with extraordinary precision and effectiveness. This brings us to an important question. What if you don't clearly identify with just one empath type? Jung's research suggests that most empaths are actually combinations of two or sometimes three types, with one serving as their dominant function. This creates unique activation requirements and protective capacities that can't be addressed with one-size-fits-all empath advice. Understanding your specific combination is crucial for fully activating your empathic potential. For example, a primarily reflective empath with intuitive as their secondary type would need to focus first on conscious mirroring practices while also developing body-centered perception as a supporting practice. A primarily intuitive empath with boundary as their secondary type would need to focus first on trusting their intuitive hits, while also developing clear, energetic differentiation to support this process. Jung observed that certain type combinations are particularly powerful once activated. The reflective sovereign combination creates what he called the ultimate narcissistic deterrent. An empath who can perfectly reflect the narcissist's disowned material while remaining completely unmoved by their reactions to this reflection. The intuitive transmutative combination creates what he described as preemptive alchemical protection, the ability to sense and transform negative energy before it's even fully deployed. Understanding your specific empath combination allows you to create a targeted activation protocol rather than applying generic empath advice that might actually hinder your particular type. This targeted approach accelerates the activation process and creates more complete protection than generalized practices can provide. As we move toward closing, I want to address a common concern. Does activation mean becoming cold, detached, or uncaring? Jung's research suggests precisely the opposite. When empaths activate according to their specific type, they typically experience an enhancement rather than a diminution of their empathic gifts. They become more effective at genuine connection, more precise in their empathic understanding, and more capable of offering authentic support without self-depletion. This happens because activation removes the distortions that unconscious absorption creates in the empathic process. Rather than indiscriminately absorbing emotional information, activated empaths receive this information with perfect clarity about its nature and source. Rather than responding from triggered emotional states, they respond from centered awareness. Rather than engaging from a place of boundary confusion, they engage from a place of psychological clarity. The result isn't less empathy, but more precise, effective, and sustainable empathy. It's the difference between empathy that depletes and empathic intelligence that energizes. It's the difference between unconscious emotional contagion and conscious empathic engagement. It's the difference between empathy as vulnerability and empathy as power. I invite you to reflect on which of Jung's 5 empath types resonates most strongly with your experience. Which activation triggers feel most relevant to your current psychological process? Which protective capacities would most transform your challenging relationships? This reflection itself begins the activation process, bringing conscious awareness to empathic functions that may have operated largely below the threshold of your awareness. Remember that activation isn't about becoming someone different. It's about becoming more fully who you already are. It's not about diminishing your sensitivity, but channeling it with greater precision and effectiveness. It's not about armoring yourself against connection, but engaging from a place of psychological clarity and choice. The 5 deadly empath types Jung identified represent different expressions of a fundamental human capacity for profound connection and perception. When you understand and activate your specific type, you transform what once felt like a vulnerability into your greatest strength. Not just for your protection, but for your full expression as the particular kind of empath you were designed to be. If this message resonates with you, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel right now and join the thousands of empaths who are navigating this activation process together. Share your experiences in the comments. Your insight might be exactly what another empath needs to hear today. And if you're ready to accelerate this process, consider joining our membership circle where we explore these dynamics in greater depth every day. Until next time, remember that your empathic nature isn't a burden to manage, but a specific form of psychological intelligence waiting to be fully activated. And when it is, you become literally untouchable to those who would exploit your gifts.